Welcome, colleagues, near and far. My name is Leora Wolf-Prusan, she, her, and I'm the School Mental Health Field Director for the Pacific Southwest MHTTC, and to be in conversation around how to get ourselves grief ready and how to get and support our organizations grief ready with the full knowing that we may never be. This is session one. Today we're focusing on kind of the intro to the starter kit, which was a publication that our center and Workplace Resilience, which MP is representing this afternoon / evening for her, put together and released in March with Dr. David Schoenfeld's advisement and many of you contributing. So this will be a little bit of a study session. I'm here with Mary Pauline, who's going to wave. You'll hear me refer to Mary Pauline sometimes as MP. So that is with permission and consent. And Dr. David Schoenfeld, who many of you know from the National Center for School Crisis and Bereavement. MP is the Senior Program Manager for Workplace Resilience, which is a project and program of the Dinner Party, which is a nationally renowned organization that supports folks in their 20s, 30s, and now 40s coming together who have lived experience to make meaning of what life after loss means. So we are three people coming together to offer some learnings with you from different vantage points. So we're offering today's flow to feel really based in the fostering grief-ready workplaces. And if you got my priming email, we're going to really be spending some time in this starter kit. So we encourage you to download it. You're going to see in this starter kit that there are excerpts from fellow school mental health and general mental health leaders from our region in the Pacific Southwest. And that's because this starter kit was co-published in our region after really sitting with many leaders throughout last year who spent some deep study time in what it means to get grief ready. And so today and next week is 2 sessions kind of inspired and based on our learnings with you and for you. So we're going to start with part 1, which is on grief readiness, the basics and how grief impacts our workforce. We're going to move into self-reflection in part 2. How grief ready am I, or is my team, or even is my system? And the third is that part 3. How do we approach grief readiness with a power analysis? With approaching grief readiness attuned to cultural sensitivity and centering anti-racism in our work. That's today. We hope that you join us in session 2, and I'll be sharing more later about what session 2 will feel like. So here we are. I literally rolled up my sleeves, so invite you to do the same. Here we are in part 1, the basics, how grief impacts our workforce. David and MP are going to be leading us through some shared language around what grief readiness is, and even the difference between grief and trauma and loss and bereavement, because in order to be a trauma-informed workforce, we actually have to be in shared language, so that when I say grief and David says grief, we actually know what we're saying at the same time. So that will be where we're going in this section. And I'm going to hand it to MP.
Great, thank you. It is an honor to be with y'all today. So I want to start just by naming, of course, that loss can come in many forms. And our time today will focus overwhelmingly on bereavement or death-related loss. And primarily we'll primarily offer examples and some questions about acutely grieving after a death-related loss. But I think it's worth naming all of these experiences that many of us have for a couple of reasons. And one is just naming again that in this moment, reflecting specifically on the particularity of death-related loss may not be accessible to you, whether by experience or what feels emotionally safe in this moment here at the end of your or in the middle of your workday. And also to name that so many of these things are intertwined and connected with each other. When we experience death-related losses, for instance, that often comes, of course, with a loss of a relationship, perhaps even a loss of a sense of our own identity when one loses a parent or a partner or someone very close to you, or when one loses somebody in a workplace setting who you might feel responsible for, like a student or a client, that these things can be turned up and interrelated with each other. So we're going to ask you to be thinking about your own grief experiences as Leora led us into. And I invite you to kind of reflect on the breadth of these, if that is what's most helpful to you in this moment, and the particularities of how these might intertwine with some of your other experiences. A lot of people come into these workshops thinking about even the last couple years and how doing telehealth or teaching from home has changed our sense of place or routine. Thinking about retirement comes with its own set of losses and griefs. And I know David will talk more about what we mean in particular when we think about grief. I won't go through all of these in particular, but I offer them again to give a little bit of nuance and detail to how you might language and understand some of your own loss experiences as you reflect on yours and your communities today. So you'll see some more detailed definitions of many of these in an appendix at the end here that you'll get when we send out these slides and everything. But just to offer some examples, so anticipatory grief, for instance, if you don't know these terms, you know, a lot of people experience this, for instance, when someone has a terminal diagnosis. And so you're not only grieving immediately after the death, but there is something in that relationship, there is something in anticipating that kind of loss that comes with its own set of experiences. Cumulative loss might be a series of losses, deaths, or otherwise that's happening in a short period of time. It might be several connected losses happening over a long period of time. For instance, losing many students or losing many people to a similar cause in a way that accumulates on each other, or experiencing losses that one that might be disenfranchised, that one might not be able to process and work through in that moment, that leaves some things unresolved that then accumulate over time. People are often curious about ambiguous grief. We have a great resource on this in detail that Leora will send out as well. But just to offer some language to that, besides that, which you might infer yourself, I often like to describe this as when someone or something is physically lost, but present in other ways, or vice versa. They may be physically present, but something else about that relationship, about your sense of that person or thing may be lost. So we think about this often. For instance, people in one's life who might have dementia, they're physically there, but your experience of that person is different and changing and comes with a sense of grieving over that relationship. We think about this often in terms of missing persons, or you might have experienced this if you had a client you were working with in depth during a precarious time in their life and then suddenly stopped hearing from them. And so the ambiguity of that can come with its own kind of particularities, nuances, different ways of experiencing grieving that might be different from another kind of loss, expected or unexpected, that you might have experienced too. So you'll see these definitions in more depth, but I often offer those because they can be helpful to folks thinking through some of these other pieces. What are the losses your team is grieving? If you want to take a few more seconds or moments here to jot down a few more thoughts.
All right, well, thank you. So what I'm going to do is talk just a little bit about some more distinctions, not so much terminology, but just making sure that we're clear about the differences in some of the different categories of terms. So I'm going to try and talk a little bit about what are we even saying when we say grief, and how is grief different from or like other issues such as toxic stress, trauma, and bereavement. So actually, if you go to the next slide, this curve just shows this figure shows some of the overlapping features of these different terms. And some of you are probably feeling like you're right in the middle of this figure, the very dark brown center. And so I'm sorry if that's where you're feeling right now. And it sounds like some people are in that place. And there is a lot of overlap. So I'm going to start with the top under stress and distress. So one of the reasons for making that distinction between stress and distress is not everything that's stressful is bad. In fact, in child development, we believe that a certain amount of stress is actually necessary for growth. So that's why kids go off to school. It is stressful, but if it's stress that is able to be managed And if the child is able to be supported through that process and reconnects, then they actually grow as a result of that. So just because you're experiencing stress does not mean that you're actually having distress. It just means you're having stress. And stress is uncomfortable in most situations, but can be growth promoting. It doesn't mean you're being damaged by it. But there are going to be situations where the stress overwhelms the individual's capacity to cope or the system's capacity to cope, and then it's referred to as a crisis. It's kind of interesting that crisis events are not actually defined by the events. They're defined instead by the individual's, groups, or systems' capacity to cope with that event in the absence of external support. So as a result, you may be experiencing distress, you may feel overwhelmed and be in crisis, but you may actually be able to cope with that, in which case then it's not actually defined as a crisis event. So it's a crisis for one person is upsetting for another person. And that gets to the next term, which is resilience. Resilience relates to the capacity for an individual, group, family, or system to cope with that distress without external support. But that does not mean that people or systems who are resilient don't experience distress. They do still experience distress, but they are able to cope with it. So a couple of reasons that that's important to clarify for the topic we're discussing today is you may see individuals who are resilient. You probably are resilient yourself, and you work with people who are highly resilient in dealing with grief. But if they are experiencing distress from someone who died that they're close to, they still warrant and deserve our support. So even if they could cope with it or recover or adapt, if we can make it easier for them and less distressing, that would be useful. Now, trauma events really talk a little bit more or deal a little bit more with a profound sense of loss of control or helplessness. And it may be associated with life threat. For example, you were worried at the time of the event that your life was in danger or the life of someone that you cared about. So we certainly see traumatic events, and I know all of you are probably have gotten some training in how to be trauma informed. Then I want to get to the next category to the left, which is around grief. Grief is really more a reaction to loss, and loss is different than trauma. And we'll go through this in a little bit more, so that the way you support someone who's had a traumatic experience may be very different than how you help them deal with their grief and a loss experience. And then just to clarify, as MP already mentioned, bereavement is a specific type of grief that has to do with grief associated with a loss by death. And so a lot of what we're going to be talking about is around how workplaces can support employees when they've experienced bereavement, but it will be applicable to a lot of these other types of situations. So if you can go on to the next slide. I want to talk a little bit about how grief may feel like trauma, but it actually is quite different. This was a quote from the author C.S. Lewis. He wrote this after his wife had died. And he said, "No one ever told me that grief felt so like fear. I'm not afraid, but the sensation is like being afraid. The same fluttering in the stomach, the same restlessness, etc." So often we have some of the same types of feelings, but if they're from loss, it is different than if it is from a traumatic event. Go on to the next slide. So trauma and grief overlap in some ways in how they might feel, because they can cause distress, but they actually are quite different. And crises often create trauma and or grief, and often they create both. Trauma can be an event, experience, or an effect, and it is highly subjective. So as with most emotions, they relate to how you identify, think about it, feel about it, and the support that you receive. So actually, trauma symptoms relate more to the perception of risk than to the actual risk that the person is at the time. Trauma is centrally characterized by something that overwhelms a person's or community's or system's ability to cope, as I mentioned, leaving them with a sense of powerlessness and harm. Grief, though, does not always involve trauma, although trauma usually involves some degree of grief. And loss does not always involve trauma, but loss generally involves some degree of grief. Now, while these trauma-informed practices are becoming more widely implemented, the impact of grief is less understood and less often addressed. So while we want to be trauma-informed, we also have to be grief-sensitive, and that requires a slightly different perspective. If you go on to the next slide. If you think about it, grief follows loss, and grief, as I mentioned, is the emotional reaction to the experience of loss. Although trauma and grief often co-occur in the lives of students and staff, especially after major crisis events where there's been a loss of life, the professional fields of trauma treatment and childhood grief actually have very little overlap practically. From the mental health perspective, emotional reactions to the death of a family member or friend are considered either normal or normative or typical and experienced by virtually everyone who's formed a relationship with someone else and has lost that relationship. Grief, therefore, is not generally considered a mental health condition that requires clinical intervention. In contrast, reactions to a trauma, even if those reactions are very similar, just like C.S. Lewis pointed out, they are often viewed as symptoms, and when they're sufficient in number and duration, they're believed to require treatment, clinical treatment. If you go on to the next slide. If you think about it, while grief support is generally provided in the family or faith community at no cost to individuals, in fact, most children's bereavement centers, for example, I don't know of any that charge for their services or support. They're really based on philanthropy models, and they tend to use volunteers that often have had very limited training, particularly limited training in the mental health field. Trauma treatment, in contrast, is usually provided by licensed and credentialed mental health professionals and often covered by health insurance. So I actually do attend conferences of both bereavement as well as trauma, and it's really remarkable how there's very little overlap between those two different fields. But those caring for students or staff who have experienced both trauma and loss, which is quite likely to occur in any crisis event, need to attend to the impact of both, as well as all the secondary losses and stressors that may result from either. So it shouldn't be assumed that every time loss and trauma co-occur, that the predominant reactions relate to the trauma, nor that the consideration of treatment is any less critical or time-sensitive than trauma. If you just think about it in the diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder, for example, if children have frightening dreams and they don't remember the content of the dreams, but they've had a traumatic experience beforehand, it is presumed that they are re-experiencing the trauma of the event. But often they're re-experiencing the grief of the loss that might have occurred. Let's say a parent died in a car accident. They may not be thinking in those dreams about how their parent died, but rather that their parent isn't present for them for the rest of their lives. And so we really should not assume that every time someone has a problem after they've experienced a trauma that was associated with loss, that it's due to the trauma. I still remember talking to one parent. An estranged spouse had entered a school and shot to death the teacher in front of the entire class, and in the process also shot and killed a couple other students. And understandably, that was a very traumatic event. It was a special ed elementary school class, so it was complicated in terms of their reactions. But by a month or two afterwards, I was talking to the mother, and I asked if the child ever talked about the teacher. And she said, well, why? What do you mean? And I said, well, was he close with her? And she said, yes, he loved her. He felt very comfortable with her. And I said, well, is he grieving her loss? And she just looked at me and she said, you know, I never considered that. So everybody was understandably talking about the trauma that the child had experienced. And that is, of course, very important. But they weren't dealing with the grief aspects. And when you're trying to treat trauma, at a very simplistic level, you're trying to help them deal with something that's happened. But when you're dealing with grief, you're trying to help them cope with the absence of something. So obviously the experience is very different and the treatment is very different. So I'll give one last example. I have had a number of situations where yearbook committees will say they're not going to put photographs of children that died in the yearbook because they are trauma triggers. But actually individuals, when you talk to survivors, after there have been traumatic events where deaths were involved, the thing they worry most about is that people will forget or not remember those that had died. So when you go to a cemetery, it does activate some of your feelings of grief, but people do that intentionally because although it is difficult to experience the grief, it is worse to forget about the person that you've lost. So people will often say that the only treatment for grief is to grieve. I don't think they would say the same thing for trauma. So you don't want to remember traumatic experiences, but you certainly want to remember people that you've lost and that you're grieving. So you just want to think about the fact that we have to address all of that. So you may have someone who works with you, and they may have had some trauma associated with it. They may have some stressors, they may have some distress, but they also are grieving someone that was important to them. And so we need to address some of that grief. That's why we talk about people who have died and ask them to share stories, because we want them to connect. I remember one girl said to me, her father died very suddenly. And she said that she still has grief triggers and it's been 4 or 5 years. And she said, but you know what? I'm glad I have them because they still remind me how much I care about my dad. So I think it's just a different type of experience, and we need to think about both. So what I'm going to do with that is turn this over to MP, and you can advance to the next slide.
Thank you. I really appreciate that, David. And particularly, I think part of the invitation you're offering there too is that often we're well practiced in avoiding grief, in setting aside, compartmentalizing, and even as we're able to see grief and trauma as these separate experiences, they may be co-occurring experiences, but separate ones, they invite us to kind of deal with them differently. So we bring up this slide too, even just as this visual of certainly grief, these experiences are not linear. You may relate with this. Sometimes my grief looks like this, where all of those pieces that we talked about earlier overlap. Some of them disappear and reappear. Some of them, the pieces that we think are going to be very large, like the traumatic aspect of it, for instance, may not actually be the thing that's in the forefront at a particular moment. So this is just kind of an invitation to acknowledging that so many of these things overlap, are messy, have particularity. And so as we move now into thinking about grief readiness and what that looks like for us at work when we or others at our work are grieving, acknowledging some of that nuance and naming some of that nuance in our own experiences. So we'll move on to the next slide and invite you again to another couple minutes of reflecting. And the question is, what might grief readiness mean in your school or work context? Of course, we'll talk about that more. And I'll share a little bit on the next slide about what we talk about at Workplace Resilience in our program. So for us, just one definition that we offer this alongside all of yours. Grief readiness is proactively preparing for the impacts of grief experiences on employee well-being and workflow. So I want to highlight, kind of break down some of these pieces. Proactively, readiness, right? The reality is that death is a part of our lives. Loss is a part of our lives. And so we know that this is going to happen to the humans we work alongside. So what can we do structurally in terms of our protocols, in terms of our cultural norms, to prepare for the reality of this happening to our teammates, to ourselves, and impacting the whole team ecosystem? Thinking about the impacts of grief experiences. So thinking about it in terms of that work sense of what this means for the whole team, but also just thinking, biopsychosocially, for instance. We know that grief has a huge impact on our emotions. We know from research and perhaps our own experiences that focus, prioritization, decision-making, all of these things are very impacted, particularly acutely after a loss, and certainly at other times in our experiences as well. thinking about even our physical well-being and what that means for how we show up to work, especially if you're on your feet in front of a classroom all day and you're sleeping too much or not enough. Your physiological stress responses and coping mechanisms are impacting your physical, mental, emotional, even meaning-making experiences. So thinking about how all of those things come into play when we think about employee well-being and when we think about workflow. So we'll move into the next slide, and I'll just offer that as an example of the reality is when we're at work, often what we want the most is to know that our work is taken care of, to know that our work is in good hands, that we are a part of, that our supervisors and teammates are supporting too. And grief readiness for a lot of reasons, one of which is because it impacts employees who disengage. That's just one perspective besides just our own humanity and everything. But I offer this quote from one of our own dinner partiers, one of our own program participants. My boss told me the nicety to take as much time as I needed, but didn't remove any work from my plate. I was afraid to fall behind and risk losing my job since I was now the main breadwinner. I came back to a mountain of tasks that felt insurmountable. And a few things that I like to highlight here are that it's not just about saying the right things, having the nice words, making the kind offer, but when somebody is worried about their job security because they have too much, work on their plate, that is a part that colludes with our own grief experiences as well. It's not just about the feelings we bring in, but how those feelings like fear or guilt for taking too much time off or any of these myriad of things we might already be experiencing for other reasons collude with our lives at work. This is just one experience. For many people, that's, these negative experiences aren't the whole story. So we'll move into the next slide. And you might even think about how you've experienced or what work has meant to you, what your relationship with work has looked like. What we often talk about in workplace resilience, what we've often heard about from people in our community and our workshops, is this spectrum of experience of going into work and feeling a sense of isolation, of having to compartmentalize because this blaring thing is happening in your personal life or even your work life that is going unacknowledged, that is hard to kind of hold alongside the reality of one's work, that it can be discouraging and disappointing, and that managers might be flailing and unready. But for many people, work can also be a place of finding community support, perhaps by surprise, of finding a sense of confidence and meaning, because work is someplace that resembles normality or stability in the midst of other chaos, or simply because, even if you experience a loss in your workplace, for instance, it may be meaningful to contribute to that team, to give back to your coworkers in that way. And certainly we can experience all of these things at once. You might think about your own experience. I am certainly the kind of person who, when I experience a loss, I want to take the week off or more. I want to shut everything down. I want to tend to myself and not think about anything but that. And really just focus my energy on healing, for lack of a better word, or moving through it. Other people in my family like to come into work as a distraction and will show up the next day and have that sense of stability, have that feeling of getting things done when everything else feels uncontrollable and chaotic. And you might experience something in between, something else entirely, many of these things all at once. And so as we think about grief readiness, and we'll talk more about this certainly next week and for the remainder of today, thinking about this range of experiences that we have is impacted by circumstances, is impacted by the nature of our loss, by how those things overlap with each other, is impacted by our own proclivities, our own cultural norms, our workplace's cultural norms, the people around us, and how all of those things contribute and work together. So in grief readiness, we're often, in workplace resilience in particular, we're often thinking about this, not just from how can I be ready to say and do the exact right thing at the right time, but how can I have the tools at hand and, a sense of assurance and support to be able to adapt when somebody is grieving differently than I might myself, or when a circumstance is a new one for me to encounter. So thinking about adaptation as a really key part of our readiness too.
On pages 22 to 24, you're going to see that there is a description of all 4 phases. We're inviting you right now to focus on the first phase, on that get ready phase. And what we're going to invite you to do is to identify one question that will be your entry point to the grief readiness work. You don't have to do everything. If you can do one thing, that's the beautiful takeaway. I'm going to give you an example, and then we'll go back to quiet reflection time. So this is on page 22. This is the snapshot of the get ready section. We offer you a starting question, and then we offer you deep dive questions. It is your own assessment of where you are as a manager, supervisor, or in your workplace, of if you're actually at the starting place, or if you have room and readiness to move into deeper dives. So the only thing we're asking you to do right now is to identify one of these questions. It could actually be the starter question, is your entry point, or the deeper dive questions is where you need and want to start your grief readiness at work. Sometimes that 5th question is our leadership team recognizing that grief readiness is a priority, and if not, how can we get stronger internal champions? I actually want to challenge myself in this, because I was one of the authors of this, which is that it doesn't always have to be your leadership team. You are also deep influencers, horizontal influencers, and internal champions are often grassroots and bottom up. Also for your colleagues who are mentioning unions and union contracts as an important element to the workforce. So second practice is that we want to reflect right now, and some of you are already doing that, on where are you in your grief readiness. Section 3. So how do we approach this grief readiness with a power analysis, both individually and thinking about systemically, of access to and whose grief is validated and whose grief is not validated, what kind of grief is validated, what kind of grief is not validated. And we're going to be taking a little bit of time to invite you to think about how your own grief bias as an individual or as a work culture or as a system influences the way that you get grief ready. So if you work in a suicide prevention organization, you may have more already listening to get grief ready for death by suicide. You also may not, because your colleagues might assume that you're all experts until it happens, and then it feels really hard to navigate for yourselves. So this is the section to start to really do some more deeper reflection on your own personhood, my colleagues, and my system. Okay, I want to just thank Sylvia Duckworth for creating these really beautiful visuals, and I'm going to encourage MP to also kind of step in and play with me for a little bit. But I want to offer that all of us carry different accesses to power and privilege, not only depending on our lifespan, but depending on the context in which we walk this world and who we're in relationship with. That's the biggest general statement I could ever make. The second statement is that all of our different access points to power and privilege influence and impact the way that we move through the world with grief bias. I want to offer an example of what that can look like for me personally, with vulnerability, so that everyone else can step into vulnerability in your own reflection space. So for example, and I just want to share, these are 2 visuals with the exact same content, but in different visual schemas, okay? So I'm going to be on the left-hand side, and I'm going to share about where I land and how that has influenced my experience both as a manager and as an employee at work, right? So In the wheel of power and privilege, I both have access to dominant culture, power and privilege, and sometimes I have less access. In the context, for example, of, I'm going to go to religion, which actually isn't on this wheel, but I want to add it to this wheel. In the context of religion, I identify as someone who is an observant Jewish woman. And we have our own very intense cultural practices for grief. I do not work for an organization whose dominant culture is Jewish. I don't even have funders whose dominant culture is Jewish. And for me then, as an employer and as an employee, as a manager, I have to navigate my own personal needs and how that sometimes comes in conflict with the dominant culture and practices of my organization. Someone cue me in the chat if you need more, or MP can cue me in the chat if you need more. So I want to just offer that for those of us, we might work in organizations where there's compatibility and alignment, where both the way that we talk about and experience grief, if we are neurodiverse and we work for an organization of many, if not all people that are neurodiverse, there might be alignment. If we work in an organization where we might have different needs because of our class or because of our race identity, in an organization that has really different displays of power and privilege, that might come into conflict. Oh yes, can you give us an example that's actually represented in your presentation? Okay, thank you, Alexis, for calling it in. So I'll talk about gender. Oftentimes a type of loss that can be gendered is pregnancy loss. And I want to be really explicit that it doesn't just mean the person whose body is experiencing the pregnancy loss, it can mean their partner or their family member as well. But it is a very oftentimes gendered experience because of access to healthcare. And so because of my experience, both as someone who identifies as a woman and because of my age, the likelihood of me having experienced pregnancy loss, which I have, is 1 in 4, which is the national standard. And so for us as an organization, if we know that there is a predominance of both of people who identify as bodies that are trying to have children or may want to have children or may navigate child-seeking experiences, then we might specifically attune our bereavement policies to know that there is a high likelihood for pregnancy loss to have occurred, be occurring, and will occur. I'm hoping, Alexis, that helps. The last piece, for the interest of time, that I want to name is that part of our invitation is for you, when you receive this tomorrow or in your own space, to map out where you land and where the dominant culture of your organization or your system might land, and to sit in wonderment of what might be some grief stories that might be missed or assumed because of different conflicting powers and accesses to powers and privilege.
So just to zoom in on kind of one community, but really not, one broad and extremely varied category of a lot of people, but referencing this great article by Elisa Forneri that I encourage you to take a look at. She contributed to a lot of this content in general. But thinking specifically about, for instance, on one of those wedges, how race identity, racism can impact grief at work for people of color. And so this says, for instance, people of color are often grieving a loss of hope and safety in addition to someone's life. So we can think about, again, thinking back to how these things overlap. If we think about how hate crime or racialized killing that's in the public media and not necessarily part of one's personal life can impact someone's sense of safety, or even thinking within a work context, if it doesn't feel safe to be able to express anger or upset or any of these normal grief emotions, if it doesn't feel safe to be able to display that to people in dominant culture, or even thinking about other hierarchical relationships in a workplace, if you are in a context where showing sadness might be interpreted as weakness, or anger might be interpreted as dangerous, and you're concerned about your safety or even just your job security and safety, which is your livelihood, that's going to have a real impact in a layered way too. Grief is a huge shared experience in communities of color. I think about this not just in terms of, we saw the quote earlier, not just in terms of disproportionate mortality, not just in terms of the losses themselves that are shared, but if I think about, so my parents are immigrants from the Philippines, and even though they've been here for like 30, 35 years or so in the United States. They live in an area without a lot of Filipinx people. So like every time they see someone, even at the supermarket, who looks Filipino, they flip out and are super excited. And I've grown to be that person too. And so there's this sense when they see each other that there's not only this shared culture, this shared connection to perhaps a homeland or a culture, but also even a sense of a shared struggle, perhaps among immigrants from a place that they know well, an experience that they've had. And so thinking about this notion of shared experience, not just shared trauma, shared tragedy, shared loss, but for many communities of color, this sense, particularly when minoritized in dominant communities and dominant cultures, that there is a sense of shared family, shared struggle. I grew up calling every elder who is Filipinx my tita or tito, my aunt or uncle, regardless of the blood relationship. I imagine many of your cultures may share something similar. In this article by Forneray, bringing this into grief in particular, one of the people who's quoted in there, a mental health advocate who is a Black woman, says, "When I look at George Floyd or Breonna Taylor, I see my sister or my uncle. When I hear Jacob Blake's family on TV, I see myself. I recognize the kind of raw pain that I would feel if that happened to my family. Each devastating loss is yet another blow to our extended family, be they blood or not." And so for many people in communities that have a shared history, shared culture, shared struggle, whether that is a ethnic or race-related culture or other parts of our own experience, that is that's a part of that too. So grief can also activate other layers of trauma for people of color, thinking back to that notion of cumulative loss, thinking even too, if you're worried about your own safety, if you're dealing with your own grieving, and many of you have maybe experienced this in this way or in other ways, but you might also be worried for your child's safety, your child's grief, and how these things layer on each other, how these things might play into an intergenerational story. If I think about losing one person in particular, and how that might feel in an Indigenous community who may also be, dealing with a series of losses in this narrative of missing and murdered Indigenous women, for instance, and how that connects to a larger intergenerational history of not only loss by proportion, but because of the power dynamics that are involved, that changes how we feel about those things because of the oppression and misuse of power and genocide, really, that comes with these layers of our experience and comes with these layers of what is disenfranchised, what we haven't been able to grieve in our own histories, what we haven't been able to grieve in our own present, what is hard to bring up and express and be real about when your workplace culture may not reflect or understand that or know to ask that question or share that experience in the same way. So I encourage you to look at this article for more detail as well. And certainly we've zoomed in on experiences that might be particular to people of color, but we can think about how all of these things interact with the other wedges that Leora was engaging with earlier, and even how some of these pieces, of course, we all hold many identities within ourselves and also particular ones to our workplace. Vocalness, I think, is an interesting one to highlight here, that we learn that in part from our own cultures, our own cultural norms, our own family cultures. And we also learn that from how we interact with people in relationship across the different hierarchies and power dynamics of a workplace. And so thinking about, I encourage you to kind of think about how these pieces overlap, how these pieces might speak to your own experience or reshape the experience of your colleagues, coworkers, other people in your community as you think through grief readiness. So we'll take another little moment for some free writing. And on page 16, there are a couple of rich quotes if you're interested in some other perspectives from folks who've been a part of this lab in the past. So I encourage, if you read them now or read them later, I encourage you to take a look at those examples that they offer. But our reflection question for the next few minutes is, what would culturally humble or culturally empowered, depending on your positionality in a situation, what would that grief support look like, feel like, sound like in your local personal work context?
I have curiosity about how those of us in mental health and school mental health workplaces can hold the same commitment and attention to knowing the definitions of the things, to the self-inquiry about how those things show up in our lived lives and our lived relationships. And that part of this cultural humility question is deeply connected to how MP opened us to, which is what kind of losses is your team holding on to? And loss itself, different types of loss itself, are different types of cultures. Loss because of drug overdose or fentanyl, loss because of absence, loss because of incarceration. They are all deeply, deeply rooted in accesses to power and privilege. So I just want to recognize and name how beautiful your sharing in the chat is, because you are really helping us enrich this conversation and also acknowledge and affirm each other as well. Because, talking about grief at work can be pretty isolating. Where are you in the readiness or not yet ready across you and your team and your system and your organization? It could even be an incredibly rich activity to map this graph itself as a team. What would it look like to be ready as a team? What would it look like to be ready as an organization? You yourselves might have different definitions. And the offering is that you actually might be in really different places depending on different points in your life, different seasons, what comes up for you. So we all talked about how holidays, this is a particular reason why MP and David and Ingrid and all of us scheduled these sessions right now, because this session might actually surface where you are not ready and where you are extremely ready. So I just wanted to offer that you might locate yourself in this moment, but it doesn't mean where you are forever, and it's not a punishment, and it's also not an A+. It's just where we are in this moment. It's a continuum. I want to share with you, we're going to close. MP's going to read this quote because we believe in a good quote as a way to integrate, and I'm going to share with you a couple ways that you can continue to be in learning with us.
So I'll read this aloud. So I invite you to just let it sink in as we transition into whatever the rest of your day or evening holds. The expectation that we can be immersed in the suffering and loss daily and not be touched by it is as unrealistic as expecting to walk through water without getting wet. This sort of denial is no small matter. The way we deal with loss shapes our capacity to be present to life more than anything else. The way we protect ourselves from loss may be the way in which we distance ourselves from life. We burn out not because we don't care, but because we don't grieve. We burn out because we've allowed our hearts to become so filled with loss that we have no room left to care.
And then how might you craft a grief readiness plan, including how to explore your bereavement leave policies? We offer a lot of resources and references, including David, the National Center for School Crisis and Bereavement, MP at Workplace Resilience, the Coalition for Grieving Students. I also run another project called the School Crisis Recovery and Renewal Project, if those of you who work in schools want to join us through that, and many other resources, as well as the definitions appendix. If any of you are interested in the cultural linguistic standards, the class standards, and how to apply those from a health equity stance into the systems of education, we have an incredibly exciting session called Aging Out or Growing Together to supporting young adults as they transition in their mental health journey. Okay, also feeling resonance with the difference between grief and trauma, the reminder to ask people how they want to grieve.